With the M-Track Solo and Duo, M-Audio has released two audio interfaces which are rivaling the most affordable interfaces on the market. So naturally the question arises, can they be any good? Well, let's find out. Hey, Julian Kraus here, and here I got the M-Track Solo and Duo. As always, the whole audio for this video was recorded with these interfaces, in this case the M-Track Duo. But I don't think I will spoil too much by saying that these two interfaces perform virtually identical. With the exceptions of the differences in the in and outputs, they are essentially the same interface, and all the measurements I made were within the manufacturing tolerances between the two. So everything I will say in this review about one of these interfaces will also be true for the other one as well. Speaking of the hardware, let's have a closer look at the two interfaces and the differences in connectivity. Starting on the front of the Solo, you get an XLR and TRS combo input, which can take microphone and line level signals, and you get a second TRS input, which can be toggled between line level or instrument input. As the name suggests, on the Duo you get two XLR and TRS combo inputs, which can record microphone signals via XLR, and the TRS connection can be individually toggled between line level and instrument input. Both interfaces provide 48 volts of phantom power, which can be turned on and off with a switch. The Solo uses a 3.5mm stereo jack for the headphone output, whereas the Duo features a 1/4 inch stereo connector. The Solo allows you to monitor the sound from your PC, or a mix of direct audio from your input and the audio from your DAW. The Duo lets you do the same, but it also gives you the option to set the direct monitoring to mono or stereo. With stereo, you will hear the audio from channel 1 on the left and channel 2 on the right. And with mono, you will hear both inputs equally on both sides. The top of the interfaces is quite similar. On both interfaces, you get a gain dial for each input and a signal LED which lights up green when there's a decent signal captured by the interface. And it will also light up red when the signal is clipping. This clipping indicator will come in handy, and I will tell you why a little later. Both interfaces also have an indicator LED for when the phantom power is engaged. The output control dials are different though. On the Solo you get a single knob which simultaneously controls the volume of the main out and the headphone output. The main out and headphone output will always play even when you have headphones plugged into the interface. So if you want to monitor your audio with your headphones only, you would have to turn off your monitors. On the Duo you get two separate dials, one of which controls the volume of the main output and the other one controls the headphone output, which I much prefer over a single control for both outputs. On the back of the interfaces you will find an old school USB Type B connection and the connections for the main output, which are unbalanced RCA connectors on the Solo and balanced TRS connectors on the Duo. Let's have a small look inside the M-Track Solo and Duo. The whole housing is completely out of plastic and the build quality feels quite cheap, which is probably also because these interfaces are super lightweight. The knobs on the top though are very easy to grab and turn smoothly. Because of the all plastic build, there is no shielding of the PCB, which makes the M-Track a bit more prone to picking up interference. Just as a test, I plugged in a 150 ohm dummy mic to simulate the use of a dynamic microphone and started a network speed test on my phone to force heavy wireless activity. I then placed my phone close to the M-Track and here is the result. This is of course a worst case scenario, but there was definitely quite some audible interference. In normal use I didn't come across any obvious interference, but because of the missing shielding you should be more careful when placing the interface and you should keep it away from potential interference sources like smartphones. Back to the inside of the M-Track, for the majority of amplification duties the M-Track Solo uses the ubiquitous NJM 4580 op-amps, and for the A to D/DA conversion they use a PCM 2900 codec, which is a really interesting thing. Well, I mean the choice of chip is not that interesting, this is what you can find in many inexpensive audio devices, but notice something? Yes, the PCM 2900 is a 16-bit converter, and the M-Track Solo and Duo are both advertised to deliver 24-bit of resolution. So that can't be right. If the converter is 16-bit only, there is no way the interface can deliver a true 24-bit performance, and you're definitely only getting a 16-bit performance with the Solo and Duo. So M-Audio, you might want to look into that. Let me shortly talk about the driver and my experience using it. When you download the driver, you get this small driver control panel, which lets you set up the buffer size and different sample rates for the M-Track Solo and Duo. Notice you cannot change the bit depth for obvious reasons. Interestingly, in the Windows Sound panel, you have the option to set the interface to 16, 24 and even 32-bit, but rest assured that the higher bit depth options do not improve the performance of the M-Track. For the sample rate, you can choose between 44.1K and 48K. One thing I notice is that this is only possible as long as no program is using the M-Track. As soon as a program starts talking to the interface, the sample rate is set and grayed out. This means that when you want to change the sample rate, you have to close all your audio programs completely before you're able to change the sample rate again, which is a bit annoying and hopefully can be fixed with a software upgrade. Okay, it is time to reveal the true audio performance of the M-Track Solo and Duo, and I'll start out with the microphone input. First, let's have a look at the frequency response, which of course should be as flat as possible to get a neutral sound. As you can see, the response has some roll-off in the lower frequencies and also towards the upper limit of human hearing. Even though this doesn't look too great, I still think that this response is very usable, as in the audible range the response is only down by around 1.3 dB, and that's only at the very extremes. This is with a gain set at the maximum, and as you would expect when setting the gain a little lower, the response improves quite a bit in the lower frequencies, making the response nearly completely flat. In the higher frequencies you can still see a small amount of drop-off and some ripple caused by the anti-aliasing filter. Overall, that's a decent response. Because I mentioned the gain a second ago, I noticed a weird behavior of the gain dial on the Solo and Duo. In the range between 1 and 9.5, the gain is distributedly relatively evenly, but from 9.5 to 10, the gain jumps up aggressively by about 17 decibels. This makes it quite difficult to properly set the gain, especially with dynamic microphones. With the gain at about 9.5, it tends to be quite low, and at 10 it can already be too much. And you really then have to micro-adjust the gain dial to set it to anything in between. The Solo and Duo both show this behavior, and it's definitely something to be aware of. Back to the measurements. Let's have a look at the distortion performance with the mic input. With a typical microphone signal, the total harmonic distortion and noise measurement swept over the amplitude shows a steady decreasing line, which sits relatively low on the graph. That's what you want to see, and this indicates that the distortion components are so low that they are buried down in the noise floor. When I made this measurement, and you might have already spotted it, I noticed that a recorded signal cannot get up fully to the clipping point before distorting. As you can see, the signal starts to distort heavily once it hits about minus 3.5 dBFS. Any signal above this point will further increase the distortion. I tried to lower the digital gain in Windows, but this just shifted the whole problem down a few dBs. So it's still best to set the Windows level to 0 dB. Now, what does that mean in practice? When setting your gain on the interface, you should definitely avoid the range from about -4 to 0 dBFS, as this will lead to heavy distortion. Luckily, the red clipping indicator LED on the interface gets it right, and it will trigger at around -3.5 decibels, and it will correctly show you if your signal is clipping. So keep an eye on that. If you're interested, here's the THD+N versus frequency graph, which shows a decent performance for the THD+N around -85 decibels over the whole frequency range. The noise performance of the mic input is of course another important aspect of the audio quality. I measured the dynamic range of the mic input, and this resulted in a usable dynamic range of 88.2 decibels A-weighted. Compared to other interfaces, this is a relatively weak performance, and this means that you have to be a bit more careful when setting your gain. If you set it too low and leave yourself too much headroom, you will introduce noise in your recordings. For things like spoken word, 88 decibels of dynamic range is plenty, but very dynamic instruments like drums, for example, can use up this dynamic range quickly, and if you then use amplitude compression on your recording, you can end up with inaudible noise floor. Speaking of noise, let's check out the preamp noise of the Solo and Duo, which is important for when you're recording with dynamic microphones, as they depend on a clean amplification to result in a low noise recording. I measured the so-called equivalent input noise, which lets you directly compare the preamp noise of many different interfaces. The Solo and Duo come in with an excellent value of -129.4 dBA weighted. This means that the preamps of the Solo and Duo are very low noise, and you can actually hear that right now. I'm currently speaking into a Shure SM7B, which is a very insensitive dynamic mic, meaning it produces a very weak signal, which has to be amplified a lot by the preamp. Let me be quiet for a second so you can have a listen to the noise floor of this setup. This is pretty much a worst case scenario, and I think we can all agree that the noise floor is extremely low. And this also answers the question, do you need a cloud lifter or fathead with the M-Track Solo or Duo? No. The preamps in the Solo and Duo are so low noise that adding an inline preamp hardly improves the noise floor at all. And because the interface has a total system gain of around 55 dB, the Solo and Duo have enough gain to bring even more demanding dynamic microphones to a proper recording level. Now let's have a look at the line level input performance and start out with the frequency response. Again, we want to essentially see a flat line here, and even though this is not completely flat, I think that this is a reasonable response. The roll-off in the lower frequencies is pretty much negligible, but towards the higher frequencies the frequency response drops off quite a bit more, sitting at around -1.3 decibels at 20,000 Hz. I still don't think that this is a very big problem, as this is at the upper limit of human hearing, where we are not very sensitive to this roll-off. So it's an okay response for the line level input. When we have a look at the THD+N versus amplitude graph, you can see that the line level input exhibits the same behavior as the microphone input, and it too starts to distort heavily above -3.5 dBFS. So my recommendation from before applies here as well. When setting the audio level, avoid the range of above -4 dBFS to not distort the audio, and keep an eye on the clipping indicator on the interface. Here's the THD+N swept over the frequency range. There you can see a small rise in distortion towards the higher frequencies, but nothing crazy, and this is still under 70 decibels below the signal, which should be completely inaudible. In terms of noise performance, I'm not that impressed. Here the Solo and Duo deliver a dynamic range of 88.2 decibels A-weighted, which in fact is the exact same as for the microphone input. This will be still good for many recordings and there shouldn't be any obvious noise here, but I would have definitely liked to see a higher dynamic range here. One more thing I noticed is that the line level input only takes consumer line level, which is essentially a weaker version of professional line level. So don't try to record professional line level with the Solo or Duo, because the input will clip regardless where you set your gain at. But to be honest, that's pretty much expected from an interface in this price range. It is time to take a look at the main output of the M-Track Solo and Duo. Despite the Solo using an unbalanced connection and the Duo using a balanced connection, the performance is completely identical. Let's check out the frequency response first. Here both interfaces deliver a solid performance with a response that's nearly completely flat in the audible range. It only shows a negligible roll-off in the lower frequencies and only a tiny bit of passband ripple. Here's the total harmonic distortion versus amplitude graph, and here the interfaces show a decent performance with distortion figures as low as -86 decibels. In terms of noise, the output also performs quite decently, as my dynamic range measurement came in at 96.2 decibels A-weighted, which is a solid performance for the 16-bit converter used by the Solo and Duo. In practice, there should be no chance to hear any distortions or obvious noise from the main outputs. One thing I will mention though is that the maximum output level of both interfaces is around 2.4 dBV, which is lower than the standard 6 dBV consumer line level, and of course much lower than the roughly 20 dBV professional line level. So if your studio monitors have a switch where you can toggle between -10 dBV and +4 dBU, set it to -10 dBV to get a loud volume from your monitors. With an audio interface, you of course also want to be able to monitor your audio with headphones, so let's have a closer look at the headphone output performance of the Solo and Duo. As always, I've compiled all my measurements into this table, which lets you directly compare the numbers, and the colors indicate how well an interface performs in a particular measurement. For the frequency response, the Solo and Duo start out with a green rating, and when we have a look at the frequency response graph, you can see that there's only a small drop off towards 20 Hz and minimal ripple in the upper frequency range. The output impedance of a headphone output should be as low as possible to not color the sound of low impedance headphones, and here the Solo and Duo come in at 10 ohms. While this isn't particularly great, this is not really bad either. In terms of power output, the Solo and Duo perform adequately with the lower impedance headphones, but they quickly tend to struggle with higher impedance headphones. Anything above 150 ohms will most likely not get loud enough. And one thing to note, the output power was measured with the monitoring switch on the interface set to the USB position. When this is set to direct monitoring, the power goes down to only a quarter of the stated value, which is about 6 decibels less output. And at that point, the Solo and Duo really don't deliver that much power anymore. I actually noticed this when I was monitoring myself while recording. I had to max out the volume dial, and on my 150 ohms headphones, I barely got loud enough to be able to monitor myself. So despite the slightly higher output impedance of the Solo and Duo, I would recommend to use more sensitive headphones around 32 to 80 ohms. This can result in a minor coloration of sound, but at least your audio will get loud enough. Of course, if you don't use the direct monitoring feature, make sure to set the switch to USB, and also make sure that the output in your OS is set to 0 dB to get the most power out of this interface. The THD+N figures with 32 ohm headphones are not that great, but the red rating makes it actually look worse than it really is. That's because it's just on the border of minus 70 decibels, where the number would get a yellow rating. So it's still an okay performance, and I doubt you will encounter any distortion, but it could have arguably been better. With higher impedance headphones, the measurement is quite a bit better, but then again, with high impedance headphones, the interface does not really deliver enough power to drive them to loud listening levels. The noise measurements with a gain set to the minimum and a typical listening levels are pretty good, and with over-ear headphones, I could not perceive any noise from the headphone output. The channel balance is nicely low, which means that when you listen to audio at low volume levels, the left and right side of your headphones will still be equally loud. And lastly, the crosstalk is very low as well, which is mandatory for a nice stereo separation. Last but not least, I want to show you my measured round-trip latency, which is the time it takes the interface to output a signal and then record it again. You want this time to be as low as possible to not perceive any delay when, for example, using it as an amp sim. With the provided ASIO driver, the Solo and Duo delivered a very respectable RTL performance, which is pretty much on par with even more expensive interfaces. Please keep in mind that the RTL is heavily affected by the set sample rate and buffer size, and the one you end up using depends on your project you're currently working on. Okay, let's sum this all up. I think the performance of the M-Audio M-Track Solo and Duo is okay, but it's really nothing special, and there are a few quirks to be aware of. For example, the gain for the input makes a big jump close to the maximum gain setting, and the signal clips at around minus 3.5 dBFS with the microphone and line level input. Because of the non-existing shielding, you should also keep this interface away from interference sources. I would have also expected a higher dynamic range, as it is quite limited compared to other interfaces. On the plus side, the preamp noise is extremely low, which gives you the ability to produce low noise recordings with dynamic microphones, and distortion levels in the usable range are also very low as well. The driver could be improved a bit, as it is currently impossible to change the sample rate once a program uses the interface. The main output on the Solo and Duo performs quite well, and this results in a nice audio quality for your studio monitors. The headphone output is definitely usable, but again nothing special. Because of the low amount of output power, you should definitely use more sensitive headphones with the Solo and Duo so that the audio will get loud enough. Now, to answer the question that undoubtedly someone has already typed into the comments, should you go with the M-Track or a Behringer interface? The Solo clearly competes against the UM2 and UMC22. Audio performance wise, the M-Track Solo is a bit better compared to the offerings from Behringer in this range. With the M-Track Solo you also get a proper ASIO driver, and if M-Audio improves this driver even further, this would make the decision a bit simpler. But regardless, at the day I'm making this video, I think the M-Track Solo already delivers a slightly better value for the money compared to the UM2 and UMC22. For the Duo it's a bit trickier. It goes up against the Behringer UMC 202 HD, and here I think the 202 delivers a better value with better build quality, more stable drivers, and a proper 24-bit converter, just to name a few things. The 202 has one big flaw though, and that's with the direct monitoring. You only hear the channel 1 on your left and channel 2 on your right, and there is no way to change that. The M-Track Duo has a very handy switch which lets you toggle between stereo and mono monitoring, but you have to decide if that compensates for other shortcomings. All in all, I would have hoped to see a slightly better performance from the M-Track Solo and Duo. Some of the directly competing interfaces are now over 8 years old, and with the big advancements in audio technology over these years, I would have hoped to see a bigger jump in audio performance, even for these very inexpensive interfaces. That said, for the money you can't really complain too much, as you really get a lot of value with these interfaces, and if you're on a tight budget, the M-Track Solo and Duo are worth a look. Please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe for more detailed reviews like this. I will see you all in the next one.